Thank you very much. Thank you. Hi, everybody. It's wonderful to be here. My name is Ewan Hyslop. Until 2024, I was head of research and climate change at Historic Environment Scotland. And it's wonderful to be invited to take part in this event. What I want to do in this presentation is take you through our approach to addressing climate impacts on Scotland's cultural heritage. There's obviously very different approaches in different countries, and there's good reasons for that as well. But nevertheless, I hope our story from Scotland will be of interest and will be helpful. First of all, quickly, who we are. So Historic Environment Scotland are a government heritage agency, like many others in other countries. In Scotland, we have quite a large responsibility. We manage about 350 properties directly on behalf of government. We're the largest operator of tourist facilities in Scotland. We have a large number of collections, objects and museums. We have a regulatory role in the planning process. We are a giver of grants and investments on behalf of government. And we have a large role in terms of undertaking research and advice and guidance and maintaining technical standards, traditional skills and materials, etc. Our historic environment is much larger than the sites directly managed by the government agency, of course. And it's worth noting, I think, that over 90% of Scotland's historic environment is undesignated, is effectively unprotected by heritage legislation. And we like to constantly say and remind ourselves that it's part of our everyday lives and our communities. And I think that's a really important point when we're trying to translate some of these policies into wider practice. Well, our climate is changing like many other places around the world. We're strongly feeling the effects of climate change. Since the 1960s, we've seen significant changes in many aspects of our weather and climate, and they're having a direct impact on our cultural heritage. A key aspect for me in dealing with climate change aspects is that this needs to be part of a wider strategic approach in dealing with climate change. So climate impacts and adaptation forms one of 7 themes in our climate action plan. And it's really important, I think, to note that there are strong connections between these different themes. And a holistic viewpoint is necessary. And we've heard that in an earlier presentation, the connection between mitigation and adaptation, traditional skills, traditional materials, etc. So I think we can't take adaptation and impacts in isolation. We have to look at the broader picture. And our approach has very much been to develop a series of strategies and plans across our organisation and other heritage organisations in Scotland to increasingly influence and change the way we do things and to mainstream all aspects of climate change across all of our activities. But our work on climate impacts and cultural heritage really starts at a higher level in government as part of the Scottish National Adaptation Plan. And culture and the historic environment forms one of 23 national objectives which span all aspects of society. So culture and heritage sits alongside transport, health, agriculture, water supply, etc. And that's really important for us because it gets cultural heritage up there with everything else and is kind of locked into the national view of climate change and part of the societal change that's required. So for me, this visibility is really important. And in the coloured table there, you can see that culture and historic environment sits within the communities theme. So that's really important. And at the bottom there, the direct objective on cultural and historic environment is really composed of 2 aspects. So Scotland's historic environment is preparing for a future climate. So that's the assessment of risk, impacts, adaptation, etc., our response to climate change. But the second part acknowledges the transformational power that culture and heritage has in supporting a wider societal adaptation journey. And I think that's really important as well, not to perceive heritage as just being a victim of climate change. It's very easy to do that, but actually we have a lot more to offer in terms of supporting wider change. And it's nice that both the previous presentations have acknowledged that as well, so that's good to see. This national remit from government helps to give us in Historic Environment Scotland the role to carry out research, to provide guidance on different aspects of climate change. And I've just illustrated some of the advice and guidance work that we've been doing recently. So technical advice in terms of traditional materials and skills and techniques. And along the bottom, some of the guidance on different aspects of climate change. So energy retrofit, climate change adaptation in traditional buildings, flood damage, and maintenance of buildings in a changing climate. All of our publications are free to download as PDFs. I've actually put hyperlinks in my presentation. I don't know if you'll be getting a copy of the presentation, but in blue, everything I'm presenting is hyperlinked, so you can download all of these. I've also brought a number of publications with me, which is a pile under my chair, which I'm going to hand to Renata at the end. I don't want to take them home, so please have them. So what I'm really going to concentrate on in this presentation is related to climate impacts and the different research approaches that we've been taking in the last few years. I'm going to take you through these three approaches one by one. On the left, we've got the climate vulnerability assessment, the CVI that Hannah's already mentioned. In the center is a quantitative approach, a climate change risk assessment of the properties in the care of Historic Environment Scotland. I'm going to dive a bit deeper into that one. And then on the right-hand side is the Guide to Climate Impacts Toolkit, which we're going to be hearing about later on today and tomorrow. Again, hyperlinks there. Whoops. Good. Okay, so very briefly on the CVI, the Climate Vulnerability Index has been developed as an international system, a standard for cultural and natural UNESCO World Heritage properties. It's been mentioned, you'll have heard of it probably as well. Interested, good to hear it's been applied in Lithuania already, and it's been more widely applied internationally. In Scotland, we've applied it to 4 of our 6 World Heritage properties. These reports are available online. I have some of these reports with me as well, which you're welcome to take. In general terms, the CVI assesses the vulnerability of a World Heritage site of 2 aspects. Seen in red here, the 2 outcomes really, an OUV vulnerability based on the outstanding universal value of a UNESCO site, and the community vulnerability, which is calculated using economic, social, and cultural values. Both of these are estimated by identifying the principal climate change impacts on a site and assessing these against adaptive capacity. The system is very much designed for World Heritage properties, so I'm not going to focus on it in detail today, but it's interesting, it's worth noting it could be adapted for other sites as well, bearing in mind the values issue, which is critical. It's definitely worth a look, and there's a link to the CVI website down there, which is worth a visit. Within Historic Environment Scotland, we undertook a project to quantify risk for the 350 sites in our care. We used available data sets of existing natural hazards available from our national agencies, so the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, the British Geological Survey. And we calculated risk using 6 natural hazard data sets: coastal erosion, ground instability, and pluvial, fluvial, coastal, and groundwater flooding. This was a GIS-based approach, and the objective was to allow us to prioritize action at our sites, to develop priority sites for action. The work didn't directly include climate change projections, but it does assume that climate change will increase these existing hazards. Well, the aim was very much to take a classic mainstream risk assessment approach, and very close to what Hannah's already shown us, and with the same intention. So on the right-hand side here is an extract from the Corporate Risk Register of Historic Environment Scotland. So this is very much a tool that government will use in terms of these 4 definitions of risk descriptors. So low being an acceptable level, very high being an unacceptable list. So it was really important that what we did fitted directly into this, so that climate risk and environmental risk sat alongside all the other risks that are being considered. And on the left-hand side is the risk assessment table. So a classic risk assessment table, universally used very, very widely. And the critical thing here is risk equals, in this case, impact versus likelihood. You can have different terminologies here, but we used impact versus likelihood. And the critical issue for us was to calculate a risk score for the hazard. We had to develop a method so that we could score both impact and likelihood in a simple 1 to 5 numerical scale. And that sounds easy, but that was actually really challenging. So how do you quantify impact on 350 very different heritage sites? That was our first challenge. We categorized our sites, first of all, into different types of monuments, inevitably taking a simplification approach. So our categories were A to F, depending on the type of monuments, so roofed buildings, unroofed monuments, standing archaeology, field monuments, buried archaeology, etc. And then we assessed the impact on these of each hazard type. So, for example, all types, in the table here, all types were highly impacted by landslide and coastal erosion, which is catastrophic, so a score of 5. But with flooding, some types were more or less impacted. So this is quite a subjective and difficult thing to do, but gave us meaningful results to feed in. Likelihood was the second aspect, and we had to estimate the likelihood of a hazard event happening, and again give that a 1 to 5 score. So for this was difficult because we were dealing with very different environmental data sets from different national sources. So you can see here on the right, the coastal flooding data, which comes from one agency, has flooding extent in 4 categories: a 1 in 10 year, a 1 in 1,000 year event, etc. Whereas coastal erosion has a 5 scale of least susceptible to most susceptible. So we had an exercise of trying to standardize these, translating these to create a 1 to 5 numerical scale for each hazard. Once we did this, we obtained a result that almost 90% of our sites were exposed to high or very high risk. If you want to make yourself unpopular with your boss, tell him that 90% of the properties he's responsible for are at high risk. That was a bit of a surprise and a bit of a shock. But what this represents is pure, uncontrolled environmental risk. And it reflects factors such as the geographical location, the exposure of heritage sites, and the sensitivity of heritage sites as well themselves. So what we then did was we took into account conservation management of the sites. So we considered factors such as care and maintenance, whether the sites are occupied or staffed or not. So for example, a site that is staffed and managed directly all year is less vulnerable, and arguably it would be less impacted than a remote site on an island, for example, which has got no people and is hardly visited. And likewise, the presence or absence of a conservation plan. So these are mitigants and controls, and we developed factors to modify the initial risk score. I should say this was a big exercise for 350 sites. I think it was 61 pages of Excel spreadsheets. So a lot of work and a lot of technical information. Once we had taken those into account by factoring in the effects of site management, the risk scores were modified and reduced the number of at-risk sites to about 50%, which was much more acceptable, of course. But importantly, while still high, was much more reasonable to deal with in terms of planning and adaptation conservation strategy for these properties. And so it allowed us to focus, for example, on the 28 sites which recorded very high levels of risk and focus on specific sites related to specific hazards. So it was much more practical in terms of allowing us to prioritize sites for action. I'm just going to show 3 examples of sites and some of the actions that we took. This is an example. This is a small valley in the west coast of Scotland. It's subjected to very high rainfall and flooding. The valley contains several hundred designated archaeological monuments. And on the left-hand side, you can see the flood risk map for pluvial, for rainfall flooding was very high. The monuments are connected by footpaths, and it's a very popular tourist site as well. So this allowed us to plan for investment in terms of adapting the visitor access with raised walkways, which worked immediately and was very effective. This is a mansion in northeast Scotland, which is situated near a river, and the fluvial flood risk was high at this site. So the mansion contains high-value art material. In fact, at the time we were working here, there was a Picasso there, which was wonderful to see. So we were able to initiate training and the establishment of emergency procedures in terms of salvage planning, emergency planning, and also to move some of the vulnerable materials to higher levels in the building and change the services in the building as well to accommodate the known hazard and reduce the risk effectively there. And the final example I'm showing is a castle near Edinburgh on the coast, which has a large area of historic harbour. And on the left top is the coastal erosion risk, coastal erosion hazard, and on the bottom is the coastal flooding, both of which highlighted a vulnerability to part of the historic site. So work was undertaken to repair the historic harbour wall, again, to reduce the risk level there. So the final project I'll talk about is the Guide to Climate Change Impacts, and others will talk about this, and we're going to work on this a bit tomorrow as well. We published this with a consortium of around 20 heritage organisations in Scotland under the Scottish Government's Historic Environment Strategy, and the aim was very much to get wider involvement and engagement and raise awareness of climate change amongst the broader heritage community and encourage shared ownership. As I like to put it, to open up conversations about climate change adaptation and improve the knowledge base. A key aspect of the approach was to divide the historic environment into 7 categories, which we called elements. So roofed buildings and infrastructure, surface remains, buried remains, internal collections, heritage landscapes and gardens, coastal and marine heritage. And whilst this is not perfect, wasn't perfect for us, it suited our context in Scotland at the time. I'm sure others have and will choose to do it differently, and we might do it differently if we started again today, in fact. The left-hand side just illustrates some of the contents of the toolkit, which was about providing facts, knowledge gaps, further research, a glossary, etc., and other useful aspects for users of this. For each element, we produced a summary graphic to highlight some of the key climate change impacts and hazards. We deliberately didn't want to overload this with too much information. We wanted to make it attractive and accessible, approachable for the reader and the user. This example is roofed buildings and infrastructure. So this signals issues such as rainfall, high winds and storms, thermal stresses, increased biological growth and flooding. And for buried remains, we identified issues such as changing underground preservation conditions, hydrology, drying out of waterlogged ground, for example, changing land use and agriculture, wildfires, storm events and ground movement and disturbance. The uprooting of trees as a result of storms was a significant factor. And lastly, for the elements, collections and internal fabric, we included highlights on hazards around increased rainfall and flooding, saturation of building fabric, higher temperatures internally, and higher internal humidity levels as well. In the guide, the real detail in the impacts guide are the impact tables. It's where the meat sits. There's an impact table for each of the 7 historic environment elements. I appreciate these are difficult to see here, impossible to see here for you, so I'm not going to go into detail. I'm just going to briefly highlight the key themes, the key points that we have. So this example is for roof buildings and infrastructure. On the left-hand side, we start with the impact. And here it's around saturation of historic fabric, causing structural damage, increased rates of decay. Then we have a section about covering the hazards that affect the element. So that's attributed in 3 parts. Firstly, to the known weather drivers, then the hazards, the weather drivers, and then the climate change causes. So in this example, the hazards would be water penetration from rainfall or flooding. The weather drivers would be increased rainfall and intense rainstorm events. And these stem from a known Scottish climate change cause, which is an increase in winter rainfall and an increased occurrence of intense summer rainfall events. On the right-hand side of the table, we talk about exposure and vulnerability. So these are factors that are related to the historic element itself, and dependent on aspects such as the geographical location, environmental exposure, and factors that influence how sensitive a historic site might be to a particular impact. So, for example, the type of materials used, the state of maintenance and repair, etc. And then finally, the last part of the table is the potential adaptation measures that might address or reduce impact. And we split this into 2 sections, which we termed resistance and acceptance. So the first, resistance, is action to prevent the impact and increase the way a historic asset will cope. And the second, acceptance, is when impact and damage is inevitable, and deals with how impact might be slowed or managed, or we might reduce the loss. So in this case, an example of resistance is increasing the capacity of water drainage and water protection on a building through increasing the maintenance regime, improving weathering details on buildings. Whereas acceptance might be to record the asset in the advance of likely damage and loss, planning for disaster, planning for evacuation, salvage of valuable materials, and also planning in the aftermath of an event, including recovery planning. So that's all I'm going to say. That's a summary of our key approaches to dealing with climate impacts. Hyperlinks again here, if you want to download any of these, please do. I hope that's been helpful to help understand the approach that we've taken. But as I say, every situation is different. And I think adaptation is the key word here in terms of the applicability of different approaches, and hopefully different methodologies can be adapted to suit different needs. So thank you very much.